Opening the central diagonal immediately asserts influence and prepares for rapid development. Initiating a dynamic Sicilian struggle. Black immediately contests the center and prepares for an asymmetrical battleground. Developing a knight towards the center. This prepares for d4 and fights for central influence. A hallmark of aggressive Sicilian play. Challenging the center and preparing rapid development. Black locks in their Sicilian setup while asserting influence over d4. Challenging the center immediately. This pawn thrust opens vital lines and forces Black to make critical decisions about their pawn structure. Initiating a central pawn exchange opens up the d-file and offers Black a chance to develop actively. Recapturing centrally establishes knight dominance and opens diagonals for pieces. Developing the knight to f6 challenges the central pawn, aiming for active piece play and preparing to castle. Solidifying central control while preparing for potential d5 advances adds pressure. Limiting Black's options. Unyielding central pawn thrust. Challenging the knight and immediately opening lines for potential tactical skirmishes. Sharpening the attack on the d7 square. This knight repositioning simultaneously creates a dynamic threat and opens lines for potential piece development. Aiming to disrupt Black's pawn structure and initiate early tactical skirmishes. Reinforcing the central pawn structure. This advance simultaneously opens a diagonal for the bishop and challenges White's knight on b5, forcing it to retreat or clarify its intentions, while also creating space for Black's pieces to maneuver. Unleashing an immediate pin. White aims to disrupt Black's pawn structure by targeting the knight defending the f6 square, potentially weakening the central pawn chain and creating future attacking opportunities. Pressing the knight away with the pawn is a direct challenge, aiming to dislodge the aggressor and gain breathing room, while also subtly preparing to push the b-pawn, potentially creating attacking chances on the queenside. Reclaiming central influence by repositioning the knight to a less vulnerable square opens avenues for queenside expansion, potentially preparing to challenge Black's pawn structure and improve piece harmony. Black aggressively expands on the queenside, aiming to seize space and push the knight away from its promising outpost. However, this advance might leave the queenside pawn structure slightly overextended and could invite counterplay if White can establish a strong presence on the queenside files. Sacrificing the bishop's attacking potential opens up a vital diagonal for the queen and aims to disrupt Black's pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses on the kingside. This bold exchange seeks to exploit the slightly uncoordinated knights and potentially initiate a kingside assault. Opening the g-file for your king. A risky but potentially dynamic choice. Sacrifices pawn structure for central initiative and attacking potential. Pioneering the knight into the opponent's camp. This advance creates a thorny outpost, aiming to disrupt Black's pawn structure and eye the king's sanctuary. Repositioning the bishop to g7 immediately shores up the kingside after the pawn structure has been compromised and prepares for the eventual castling maneuver, while also maintaining a keen eye on the center. Fortifying the central pawn chain with c3 aims to solidify White's e4 pawn and potentially open a path for the queen's rook, but it does create a slight weakness on the d3 square, which Black might exploit later with pieces like a knight or bishop. Unleashing the pawn chain aggressively. Black aims to shatter White's central control and open lines for their pieces. A bold response to White's slightly cramped knight positioning. Orienting the bishop towards the kingside. This maneuver prepares to challenge Black's nascent pawn storm and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around the monarch. This developing maneuver aims to activate the knight towards the kingside, potentially preparing for f4 or to simply improve its central influence. But it allows white's queen access to a menacing diagonal and leaves the kingside pawns somewhat disconnected, potentially creating targets. Unlocking the central files becomes the immediate priority as white concedes the knight pair. A decision that fundamentally alters the pawn structure and opens avenues for piece activity. A bold reclamation of central influence. By repositioning the queen, black immediately challenges white's d5 knight and aims to activate the queen into the game, while simultaneously preparing to potentially consolidate the pawn structure. Unleashing castling. White prioritizes king safety, tucking their monarch behind a solid pawn wall, a crucial step in stabilizing this dynamically unbalanced position. Securing the monarch now solidifies black's defensive structure, bringing the king to relative safety behind the pawn shield and out of the center's potential crossfire. This maneuvering of the knight to c2 aims to reinforce the d4 square, potentially preparing a future advance of the d-pawn or creating a safe haven for the knight should the queenside become more active. It also untangles the d-file, allowing the queen to potentially access it later. Initiating a bold pawn thrust. 15. f4 injects immediate dynamism into the center, aiming to disrupt white's nascent queenside structure and potentially open lines towards the white king, albeit at the cost of creating a potential outpost for white's knight on d5 and weakening black's kingside pawn cover. Seizing the open queenside flank. This advance aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create lasting weaknesses before the central storm fully erupts. Opening that queenside pawn chain provides black a new diagonal for the queen and opens the b-file, potentially creating tactical opportunities or a pathway for future piece activity, though it does leave the a4 pawn somewhat isolated. The rook now occupies the vital open file, poised to exert pressure on the queenside and potentially target the light-squared weaknesses black has inadvertently created by advancing the f-pawn. Black boldly charges the kingside with the queen, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure after white's pawn capture. This aggressive maneuver creates immediate threats and demands white's careful attention, potentially leading to sharp tactical exchanges or forcing a defensive repositioning of white's pieces. Addressing the pawn chain's central vulnerability. This maneuver attempts to shore up the e4 square and prevent black's further pawn thrusts on the kingside, though it does create a structural weakness on the dark squares around white's king. Black's bishop now eyes the central complex, seeking active participation while white's knight on c2 appears somewhat passive. This repositioning of the bishop to the active diagonal, aligning with the queen and aiming at the castled kingside, creates immediate pressure and seeks to exploit the slightly weakened dark squares around black's monarch, particularly after the recent pawn thrusts. Reorganizing the monarch's position offers a slight improvement in safety, creating a subtle connection between the rooks on the back rank and indirectly reinforcing the queenside. This rook maneuver, rerouting via f2, sets the stage for a dynamic central advance, potentially preparing e4-e5 to shatter black's pawn structure and open lines towards the weakened kingside. Developing the bishop to e7 solidifies the pawn chain and prepares to connect the rooks for potential action on the f-file. The knight's hop to b4 initiates an aggressive overextension, aiming to disrupt black's queenside harmony and potentially isolate the opponent's pawns. This maneuver forces a decision from black on how to address the incoming pressure, potentially creating weaknesses if not handled with precision. White hopes to exploit the open a-file and create attacking opportunities against the uncastled king or weak pawn structures. Breaking open the center with this pawn push exploits the slightly uncoordinated state of white's pieces. It creates immediate tactical possibilities and challenges white's knight on b4. The central tension ratchets up significantly, demanding a precise response from white to avoid falling behind in development or material. This move injects significant dynamism into the position, transforming it from a relatively quiet maneuvering game into a sharper, more confrontational struggle where precise calculation will be paramount. Opening up the d-file with this capture forcefully challenges black's central pawn structure and aims to disrupt the harmony of their pieces, particularly the queen. It's a bold maneuver that sacrifices a bishop to gain initiative and potentially exploit weaknesses in black's king's safety, forcing a sharp response. Black opens up the central files for an assault, directly challenging white's central control and immediately aiming to dislodge the bishop that was so aggressively placed. Sacrificing material for initiative, the rook on a8 is captured, opening the queenside files and aiming to destabilize black's king position. Unleashing the rook to the g-file now aims to create dynamic pressure against white's castled king, even after the exchange of material, hinting at a potential tactical skirmish on the kingside where black's pawn structure is compromised but pieces are active. Reclaiming the pawn necessitates a regal repositioning, albeit one that exposes your sovereign to the tempest brewing on the queenside. Black liberates the bishop, creating an immediate tactical threat of discovery by reopening the g-file for the rook, forcing white to concede the exchange to prevent checkmate. The king's hurried retreat, seeking the dubious safety of the second rank, exposes it to potential future skirmishes. A bold repositioning. Unleashing a tactical onslaught. This bold sacrifice ignites the queenside, aiming to dismantle white's pawn structure and expose the king. Unleashing the monarch toward the center is a bold, almost reckless, gamble, seeking to exploit the exposed enemy king while sacrificing pawn structure and potentially opening up lines of attack on your own king. Unleashing the bishop to e3 seizes an opportunity to pierce white's disorganized pawn structure, creating immediate threats against the f2 rook and potentially opening lines towards the enemy king. Sacrificing the bishop there creates a startlingly open diagonal for the queen and rook battery, forcing black to confront a sudden, unpredicted onslaught rather than a measured build-up. A bold decision, sacrificing material for immediate tactical disruption, fundamentally altering the game's character towards a sharp, uncertain melee by directly engaging the white monarch after a series of bold positional maneuvers. Venturing the monarch toward the center. This decision immediately addresses the immediate pressure on the white king, attempting to secure it behind a wall of pawns rather than leaving it exposed on the edge of the board. Unleashing the rook to the heart of white's position. This maneuver aims to exploit the currently exposed nature of the white king, creating immediate threats along the g-file that will demand careful consideration and potentially force defensive concessions. Unleashing the queen to threaten the h2 pawn. This move simultaneously eyes the now undefended d5 square and prepares to connect the rooks for potential central action or a foray up the newly opened d-file, adding immediate tactical dynamism to the position. Suddenly, a glimmer of counterplay emerges as black seeks to activate their bishop on an unusually exposed diagonal, relocating the monarch to safety. This king's journey to the corner emphasizes the critical need for defensive repositioning as black's powerful bishop now looms over the queenside, creating immediate threats and potential mating nets if white doesn't carefully manage their pieces. Black's bishop on f1, now positioned on the same diagonal as the white king, creates a piercing threat that white must acknowledge. potentially forcing awkward defensive maneuvers. Reclaiming initiative by clearing the now somewhat awkwardly placed queen offers a breath of fresh air, aiming to redeploy into a more active position and prepare for potential piece exchanges that could alleviate some of the current central congestion. Unleashing a queen sacrifice here immediately clears the board of major material, signaling a dramatic shift towards an endgame where black's rook activity and the exposed white king are key factors. The king bravely ventures into the heart of the action, a bold gambit to secure the queen and disrupt black's nascent attack, while simultaneously aiming to consolidate white's material advantage. Securing the monarch amidst the rubble of the queenside, this king now ventures outward, eyeing potential activity on the kingside where his defenders remain. This pawn push on the flank now establishes a clear pawn chain, aiming to solidify the center and potentially create advanced outposts for the remaining pieces. A crucial step in navigating this open-ended position after the queen's departure and king infiltration. Suddenly, black injects a burst of activity into the position, seeking to exploit white's somewhat exposed monarch and the open diagonals that could be turned against the king. A surprising initiative on the kingside is now met with a bold material grab, sacrificing a piece to disrupt black's attacking formation and open up lines. Forces a king retreat into a compromised square, offering a chance to consolidate after the rook sacrifice. The king's perilous journey across the board, a dramatic scramble from the relative safety of the kingside to the now chaotic center, exposes a desperate attempt to cling to material that is rapidly slipping away. This audacious capture, while removing a pawn, leaves the black king dangerously exposed as the queens depart the board, potentially accelerating the endgame transition in white's favor due to the queenless position. A bold repositioning. The knight's return to c6 aims to challenge black's bishop control and potentially initiate a counterattack on the queenside, seeking to disrupt the harmony of black's advanced pieces. Executing a royal discovery aims to exploit the compromised king's position by forcing an immediate, potentially game-ending confrontation and opening a critical diagonal for the rook's decisive advance. Confronting the rampant open files after the rook sacrifice, this king venture desperately seeks sanctuary, highlighting white's king's exposed position following an overly aggressive queen hunt. The black bishop, now unimpeded by the knight's prior control, swings to a commanding diagonal, initiating a potential harassment of white's castled king and adding pressure to the now exposed b3 square. Seizing the open file with the knight, white creates immediate pressure and looks to untangle their pieces from black's active defenders. A bold gambit to expose the king, forcing a reaction and potentially opening new lines of attack, though it risks overextending if not followed up decisively. The white king's retreat is a desperate attempt to escape the impending tactical storm, a stark admission that the earlier aggression has backfired, leaving the monarch exposed and the army disorganized. The exchange of queens is inevitable here, and this particular sequence allows black to solidify their position after a period of tactical chaos. By removing white's bishop, black neutralizes a dangerous attacking piece and simplifies into an endgame where their material advantage, though small, will become increasingly relevant. The king is still somewhat exposed, but white lacks the necessary coordination to exploit it effectively in the coming moves. Exploring the open c-file with the rook offers a chance to create immediate pressure on black's underdeveloped pieces and potentially target the weakened pawn structure around the king. Shifting the rook to the open file now aims to exploit the pressure it can exert on the now exposed white king, potentially forcing concessions or setting up discoveries. Sacrificing the rook to force a checkmate sequence opens up the possibility of a swift conclusion. The black king, now exposed after the earlier rook sacrifice, finds itself squarely in the firing line of white's rook, forcing an immediate defensive repositioning to avoid capture. Unlocking the passed pawn's potential across the board now becomes paramount, aiming to sever the enemy king's escape routes and force a critical decision. The king now finds itself in an exposed position, a stark consequence of white's earlier gambits, and black masterfully exploits this with a decisive check, forcing further retreat and a potential material gain. The king's journey towards safety finally reaches its destination, a critical step to consolidate the advantage after a series of exchanges. Black's pawn push ignites a critical race, aiming to outrun white's monarch and support an unstoppable passed pawn, while white must desperately contain this advancing threat. The bishop's repositioning to c4 attempts to regain control over the central squares and potentially restrict the rook's activity on the 7th rank, while also eyeing the f7 pawn. Finally, liberating the rook from its passive blockade allows it to rejoin the fray, aiming to exploit white's compromised king position and potentially set up a discovered attack or support a decisive pawn advance in the endgame, clearing the path for the knight to potentially infiltrate further. Pivoting the rook towards the kingside now offers a potent threat to disrupt white's pawns, potentially opening critical lines for attack or creating surprising defensive counterplay.